Welcome to the last signal ever heard from the Caucasus Patrol, a whisper half buried in static before the radio went silent forever. It came through at 02:17 hours, December 14th, 1942. White light above the ridge, men missing, snow, moving, then nothing. No follow-up transmission, no coordinates, no survivors. For 3 days, command tried to raise them. Static answered back. When a recovery team finally reached the pass, all they found were frozen rifles stuck upright in the ice, boots half buried, and a trail of footprints that simply stopped. No bodies, no blood. Only silence, as if the mountain itself had swallowed them whole. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Tell us what you feel when a story opens not with victory or defeat, but with disappearance. December 1942. The Caucasus Front. The air thin as razors, the peaks glittering like knives. Below those ridgelines, two empires clawed at each other. Hitler's Wehrmacht pushing eastward, Stalin's Red Army refusing to yield another meter. The patrol that vanished belonged to the 9th Rifle Corps. 32 men under Captain Mikhail Borodin, ordered to cut across the pass near Mount Elbrus and report on German supply movement. The weather had turned without warning. What was meant to be a 12-hour reconnaissance became a death march into white oblivion. Wind screamed across the ridges. Engines failed in the cold. Radio batteries froze solid. At minus 35 degrees, even breath crystallized before it left the mouth. Reports from nearby units spoke of blizzards so dense that soldiers tied themselves together with rope to keep from vanishing in arm's-length fog. But Borodin's patrol had pressed on because orders were orders, and retreat meant court-martial. The last coordinates placed them halfway up the Baksan Gorge near the very route ancient shepherds once called the Road of No Return. By dawn the next day, the mountain was silent again. A German forward observer recorded in his field diary, "We heard something strange through the storm. Not fire, not shells. Voices." Then it stopped. Soviet command logged them missing at 10:00 hours, December 15th. Official cause, extreme meteorological event. Unofficial rumor, the mountain took them. Even decades later, the record remains split between science and superstition. The Soviet archives, declassified in the 1990s, list the patrol as presumed perished unlocated. Yet among mountaineers and local shepherds, the legend survived that the snow around Elbrus remembers the voices of those who die there. That on certain nights, radio static in the valley still carries that same fragment white light above the ridge. The Caucasus campaign itself was chaos. By late 1942, Hitler's Army Group A had pushed deep into the mountains seeking control of the oil fields near Baku, the lifeline of the Soviet war machine. German engineers had already mapped routes through the passes. Luftwaffe planes prowled the skies, dropping supplies to advanced detachments stranded in the cold. Stalin's generals responded with desperation, flooding the region with hastily assembled units of mountain troops, sappers, and local volunteers. The fighting was brutal, primitive, fought less by artillery than by avalanches and frostbite. Men froze before they could even fire. Within this storm of steel and snow, small patrols like Borodin's became expendable. 32 men with a single radio, 5 rifles, short limited rations, and no air cover. The logistical reports from the 9th Corps' quartermaster that week show shortages in everything from wool blankets to morphine. Ammunition for their rifles was mixed batch, some from pre-war stock, some confiscated from retreating units. In truth, they were walking into a place where even maps contradicted one another. Soviet topographic sheets misprinted elevations by hundreds of meters. Still, something about this particular disappearance haunted both sides. German mountain troops who later advanced through the same sector found strange signs, campfires still smoldering days after the storm rations unopened, snow pressed flat as if by hundreds of feet, though only 32 were listed missing. When questioned, a captured Soviet radio operator reportedly muttered, "They're still up there, but not as men." The interpreter dismissed it as delirium. There's a reason the mountains of the Caucasus have always been whispered about more than described. Even ancient travelers spoke of voices beneath the snow. Local folklore claims that Elbrus is not one mountain, but two twin peaks marking a gate to the underworld. During the campaign, soldiers joked bitterly that the mountain chose who would live or vanish. But behind the jokes lay real fear. When entire units disappeared without a trace, even hardened commanders began ordering prayers before ascents, something unthinkable in the atheist army of Stalin. For the men of the vanished patrol, their final hours can only be reconstructed through fragments, half-burned notes recovered from a melted tin box, an unspent flare cartridge lodged in the ice, a torn sleeve marked with a captain's insignia. One note reads, "Visibility 0, wind direction unknown, cannot tell sky from ground." Another light above ridge, not flare, not German, no sound. Investigators later tried to rationalize it, atmospheric glow, St. Elmo's fire, phosphorescence from munitions. But the handwriting trails off mid-sentence as if the writer looked up and never finished. As the snow reclaimed their tracks, command issued silence. No broadcasts, no morale reports. The army couldn't afford stories of vanishing patrols, while Stalingrad still burned to the north. Files were sealed. Families received telegrams marked simply MIA. Yet among soldiers along the front, the legend spread like frost across glass, that somewhere beyond the last ridge, a patrol still marched inside the storm. Tonight, as you listen, imagine standing there, wind screaming through the pass radio in your hands, waiting for a reply that never comes. Think about the men who believed they'd return by dawn, whose boots froze mid-stride. 32 names erased not by enemy fire, but by the mountain's indifference. History remembers victories and defeats. It seldom remembers those who simply disappear. This was the Caucasus winter of 1942, where logic ended and the mountains began to take men the way the sea takes ships. And somewhere in that frozen silence, a transmission still loops in ghost frequency, the last breath of a patrol that became a legend. Before we continue deeper into what truly happened, leave your thoughts below. Have you ever been in a storm so loud it made you doubt the world existed beyond the noise? Have you ever heard static that sounded almost like a voice? Because what came next would turn a simple reconnaissance order into one of the most chilling mysteries of the Eastern Front. December 1942. Official records mark the Caucasus sector as impassable terrain. But the maps lied, men were still sent through it. The 9th Rifle Corps logged 41 reconnaissance missions that month. 7 returned. 4 reported frostbite casualties exceeding combat wounds. 1 vanished completely, Borodin's patrol. The 9th Corps' field headquarters near Nalchik operated under -30-degree conditions. The command logbook archive reference 1942, Cock Op 32, lists the order plainly. Conduct forward reconnaissance of German positions along Baksan Valley. Objective, confirm roadworks near Elbrus. Estimated duration, 12 hours. Equipment, 1 radio set. Type RBM, range 10 kilometers. Ammunition, 150 rounds per man. Rations, 48 hours. No mention of survival kits because none were issued. At the same time, the German 1st Mountain Division Gebirgsjäger maintained a network of forward outposts across the same passes. Their war diaries, later seized and translated by the Soviet War Archives, show similar entries, visibility 0. Wind 90 kph, snowdrifts covering signal wires, patrols unable to advance. Yet even under those conditions, German engineers were laying fuel lines and cable routes through the ice. The Caucasus front was less a line, more a shifting fog of detachments lost in white. Radio intercepts from the Wehrmacht Signal Corps in early December report unknown Soviet transmissions irregular, distorted. Analysts labeled them non-combat static phenomena. But the intercept transcript preserved in File 212B Berlin War Archive records one chilling repetition across several nights. White light, men missing. The last verified message from Captain Borodin's unit was transmitted via station Sokol 3 frequency, 7.32 megacycles, at 02:17 hours, December 14th. The operator, Corporal Leonid Stepanov, confirmed. Transmission ended abruptly. Power surge registered before silence. The technician's log adds sounded like wind but too rhythmic. Meteorological data, cross-checked decades later, show a blizzard forming over the Caucasus Ridge between 0140 and 0300, temperature dropping from -24 to -36 Celsius within 30 minutes. Barometric pressure collapsed so fast that altimeters malfunctioned. For soldiers navigating by sight and compass, the storm would have erased all orientation. The phrase "cannot tell sky from ground" found in Borodin's notes was literal. German aerial reconnaissance on December 15th spotted what they thought was an abandoned Soviet camp, 5 tents flattened, several shapes half buried. The pilot's report discovered in Bundesarchiv Freiburg mentions strange concentric tracks near the site, circular, not linear, as if the men had walked around something repeatedly before disappearing. Soviet recovery units dispatched 2 days later found nothing but empty rifles and frozen mess kits. The report filed by Lieutenant Polunin reads like an autopsy of absence, no footprints beyond perimeter. No animal signs. Tents collapsed outward, not inward. That one detail haunted investigators. Outward collapse meant the men had left suddenly all at once from inside. The official conclusion, dated January 1943, declared loss due to extreme weather, probable avalanche, but the topography near the site showed no slide marks. Later analysis by geologists in 1965 confirmed it. Snow layers intact, no evidence of mass displacement. So what forced 32 trained soldiers to abandon shelter simultaneously? Fact lines diverge here. Military physics says hypothermia can induce confusion, hallucinations, paradoxical undressing, disorientation, flight response. Yet Borodin's men weren't rookies. Half had served since the Finnish front in 1940. They knew cold, they knew blizzards. Their boots, found upright and frozen, suggested they had left in haste but not panic. And no bodies were ever recovered despite thaw cycles that later exposed other wartime remains nearby. The logistics trail deepens the mystery. Quartermaster reports from the 9th Corps inventory show an unaccounted shortage of 1 full crate of flares, 24 units. Only 2 were found at the site, both unfired. Ammunition count, however, matched the departure list, meaning they hadn't fired a shot. So where did the missing flares go? The file includes 1 more anomaly: radio component, RBM3 capacitor coil burnt from internal surge. Soviet engineers rechecked the unit, no sign of external lightning damage, no overheating from power grid. The frequency at time of failure matched the upper range of atmospheric interference sometimes caused by geomagnetic storms. But on that date, geomagnetic activity was minimal, almost flat. The weather, in other words, killed men, but spared electronics except that one radio. The following week, the NKVD attached a separate memorandum to the case. Classification: psychological contagion. The officer in charge, Major Chernov, theorized that the patrol succumbed to panic following exposure to atmospheric luminous phenomena. He referenced similar wartime cases: Finland, 1939. Karelia, 1940, where soldiers reported white plasma lights during ionized snow events. Most scientists dismissed it as St. Elmo's fire, static electricity glowing on metal surfaces, but the phrase "above the ridge" kept returning in witness statements. And the coordinates aligned precisely with an old geological fault line known for gas emissions during thaw cycles. Methane phosphine igniting under pressure, possible. Yet it doesn't explain the footprints ending mid-slope. Even in worst storms, men leave trails. Investigators traced 31 sets for 50 meters, then nothing. No return tracks, no drag marks, snow undisturbed beyond that line, as if they had stepped into air. The case disappeared under bureaucracy. In early 1943, the 9th Corps itself was annihilated during the German counteroffensive. Surviving staff officers were reassigned, files scattered. When the war ended, Soviet archives closed the dossier under the term "neobjasnimые потери," unexplainable losses. For 40 years, that phrase remained buried under layers of paper and frost. But fact has its own memory. In 1987, mountaineers exploring the Elbrus South Slope found fragments of Soviet gear, rusted rifle bolts, canvas scraps, and 1 tin container sealed in wax. Inside, a small journal, water-damaged, written in faded ink. The handwriting matched Borodin's known signature. Only 4 lines were legible to. 42. Light still visible. No sound. Men restless. Wind stopped. Feels like waiting for something. Even after decades, the entry reads less like a diary than a countdown. Science offers comfort explanations we can measure. But fact files from the Caucasus resist measurement. For every statistic, there's a silence. For every number, an absence. 32 names, 32 serial codes, 0 remains. War historians often argue that disappearance is just misplacement, that the mountains hide bones until snow recedes. But those ridges have melted and frozen for 80 winters now. Nothing has surfaced. Satellite scans in 2010 mapped the entire area down to 1-meter resolution, no trace of human remains. So what began as a patrol order has become a paradox, a factual void that neither side could fill. In the Soviet reports, it's a meteorological tragedy. In the German notes, a ghost incident. In the memory of locals, a curse older than the war itself. And maybe that's the truest fact of all, that sometimes in places where nations fight, the land keeps its own casualties. The Caucasus Mountains have swallowed empires before Persian, Ottoman, Russian. Each left bones beneath the ice. But Borodin's patrol left nothing, not even a grave. Only a single recorded pulse, a radio breath frozen in static. When historians listen to that file today, cleaned by modern software, they swear they hear a second voice behind Borodin's. A whisper layered beneath the signal. 2 syllables. Maybe interference. Maybe echo. The log reads simply unverified anomaly. And so fact remains, the coldest truth of all 32 men entered the storm, and not one came back. Night came early in the Caucasus, long before the sun had any chance to fade. The peaks swallowed light by 4 o'clock, and the world turned blue, not dark, not bright, just endless blue like frozen steel. Captain Mikhail Borodin sat beside the radio crate, his gloves stiff with ice, listening to the wind whisper through torn canvas. He had 29 men left. 3 were still out setting guide poles. The storm was moving faster than forecast, if forecast still meant anything here. Battery at half, the operator muttered. Signal fading. Borodin nodded, not because he heard, but because he knew what came next. In this cold, batteries died like lungs, slowly, without sound. Around them, the camp breathed frost. Rifle bolts clicked open and shut as men tried to keep them from freezing solid. The youngest, Private Yuri Antonov, 19, from Kursk, was tracing names in the snow with a stick. Letters that froze before they finished. Another soldier, Senior Sergeant Makarov, was arguing with the cook over whether to light the stove. Smoke could betray them, but frostbite was already blackening fingers. Borodin finally said, 1 minute only. They burned a single match, its flame trembling like a heartbeat in the wind. At 2000 hours, the snow thickened into walls. The mountains vanished. Even the glow of the compass lamp became a blur. A scout stumbled back into camp, shouting through the storm, path gone, markers buried. He dropped his pack face, rimed white. The wind had erased every sign of direction within minutes. Borodin checked his map, ink frozen compass needle trembling, like it feared its own bearings. Hold position till dawn, he ordered. We move when visibility returns. No one slept. The wind grew voices, deep, hollow, circling the tents. Men swore they heard footsteps in the snow outside. Makarov laughed it off, echoes, mountains talking. But no one smiled. Fact records confirm a barometric collapse that night, pressure dropping to 706 millibars, the lowest reading of the winter. Survival charts later marked such conditions as immediate frostbite risk under 10 minutes. Yet they stayed awake for hours, eyes open, waiting. By 23 Hosru, the radio picked up static, rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat. The operator tapped the dial, thinking it was interference from German frequencies. But amid the crackle, a voice surfaced, faint, distorted white. Light. Above. The men froze. Borodin leaned closer. Repeat transmission. Nothing. Then again. Ridge. And the sound of air rushing, not wind, but something heavier, resonant, metallic. The entry in the recovered field log matches this moment exactly. 2307 radio anomaly, repeated phrase, white light above ridge. No source ID. Transmission ended abruptly. At 23:30, Antonov said he saw the light not ahead, but overhead. A dim glow spreading across the sky, silent, colorless, like snow lit from within. It's the aurora, someone said. No aurora this far south, Borodin replied. He stepped out of the tent, his breath turning to glass, and stared upward. The mountains glimmered, not moving, not glowing, but breathing. The snow fell slower, then stopped. His next words were recorded by one of the scouts, later found written in graphite on a map scrap: "If this is light, it has no heat." Folklore among mountaineers later called this the night of the still storm. Temperature readings held steady at -36, yet no wind moved. Sound carried strangely. Men could hear shovels scraping 200 meters away, though no one was there. The silence had mass. By 00:15, Borodin ordered perimeter check. 2 soldiers left with ropes tied to their waists, standard mountain procedure. Minutes later, 1 rope went slack. The second soldier shouted, "I can't see him." He tugged back the line. It came up cut clean, not frayed, not broken, sliced as though by a blade of glass. Borodin reeled in the end. The fibers were fused, melted together. No shot was fired. No scream. He ordered all men inside the main tent, rifles ready. The journal entry stops here, ink dragged across the page as though the writer's hand was pulled. At 001, the last transmission was sent, white light above the ridge. Men missing. Snow. Moving. In the declassified NKVD transcript, that final line was underlined twice. The recording, recovered decades later, matched the pattern of a real transmission voice, stressed by cold consonants, clipped vowels swallowed. Experts identified Borodin's tone, measured, controlled. No panic. Then a surge like feedback from a nearby source, followed by absolute silence. Fact corroborates the moment. Weather satellite retrodata shows a sudden electromagnetic spike above Mount Elbrus at exactly 02:17 UTC. Duration 3.2 seconds. Power equivalent 30 kilowatts. No lightning recorded. Eyewitness fragments from other Soviet units 10 kilometers east describe a glow like dawn in the wrong direction. German observation posts saw the same phenomenon. One log entry reads simply, "Unexplained illumination, northwest." Duration seconds. Source unknown. Inside Borodin's tent, the men could have thought dawn had come early. Maybe they stepped out, expecting morning, not realizing it was the mountain itself reflecting something unseen. Or maybe the storm broke open, and whatever they saw pulled them toward the ridge. The recovery patrol found the ropes outside still tied to the tent poles, leading nowhere. The human story ends here at the line where fact becomes absence. Those who've spent winters in the Caucasus know what happens to men in that cold. The mind slows, the heart races, the line between dream and survival blurs. Some walk toward mirages, some sit and freeze with eyes open. But every expert who studied this case agrees there should have been bodies. There were none. Not even bones when spring came. Perhaps the mountain buried them under ice shelves. Perhaps the snow shifted and sealed them in blue caverns no human has reached since. Or perhaps, as the locals whisper, they simply became part of the mountain's breath, the wind that still hums through those ridges on winter nights. A shepherd named Arsen Kadyev, interviewed in 1968, swore he once found a rusted Soviet bayonet high above the pass. Next to it, a patch of ground where no snow ever stayed, even in January. I heard something, he told the researcher, like men walking behind me, but there was no one. That testimony was archived but never published. And maybe that's how the story should stay, caught between record and echo, where 32 men still march somewhere beyond the white horizon, forever chasing the ridge that took them. They said the voices came first, faint, distant, but human. The men thought it was another patrol somewhere beyond the ridge calling coordinates through the storm. But when they answered, the replies came too fast. Identical tone, identical cadence, repeating their words like a mirror. Confirming, position, confirming, position, until the air itself seemed to speak back. The radio operator swore he heard his own voice echo before he spoke, as if the mountains were transmitting in advance. In 1942, there was no word for such things, only confusion and fear. Later engineers would name it feedback delay, but even they admitted the delay was impossible under those conditions. The first Soviet analysis logged it plainly: echo transmission interval 0.8 seconds. Source unknown. The Caucasus Range is one of the oldest folds on earthstone, layered with iron quartz and magnetite, a natural amplifier. Under extreme pressure, those minerals can generate electric discharge, even sound, a phenomenon geologists call piezoelectric resonance. When the blizzard struck Borodin's position that night, barometric collapse could have triggered a static field strong enough to distort their signal. That's the scientific explanation. But the tape tells another story. In 1984, when the recording was cleaned in the Moscow acoustic lab, Technicians heard two voices, not one, both Borodin's, one slightly lower following, half a breath behind. And buried beneath the static, a third tone non-linguistic, pulsing like a heartbeat. When they slowed the reel to 1/10 speed, the pulse formed a rhythm. 3 syllables, whispered, unidentifiable. The transcript labeled it unclassified vocal layer. German intelligence reported the same interference that night. Signal Unit 456 filed unknown Russian transmission, repeating German traffic in reverse sequence. Their operator wrote that it felt like our own orders being thrown back at us. Later, Soviet investigators compared both sides' logs and found the echoes matched the same words looping across enemy frequencies seconds apart, each side convinced the other was transmitting first. It wasn't a duel, it was a reflection. The mountain had become a radio of its own. But reflection doesn't explain the voices that continued after the transmitters died. Survivors from nearby Soviet units swore they heard speech in the wind, names, commands, fragments of prayer. Meteorological sensors recorded no wind direction. Change yet, the sound persisted circling the valley, as if trapped in invisible glass. The NKVD Acoustic Division tested the theory in 1943, setting up dummy transmitters along the Baksan Gorge. When they replayed Borodin's frequency, they received faint replies, phrases copied from their own outgoing messages, scrambled, but recognizable. The final report classified it as atmospheric resonance phenomenon. Still, one engineer added a handwritten note in the margin. Signal repeats content never broadcast. By the 1950s, the file was legend. Geophysicists called it the Borodin Echo. In 1956, an expedition drilled through the ice near the site. At 15 meters, they hit a cavity filled with metallic fragments. 3 helmets, 1 melted radio casing. The metal had fused from inside out, as if heat had burst outward from the coil. Radiation readings showed a mild spike, nothing lethal but high enough to raise questions. Lightning leaves scorch marks. This left none. The report vanished into the archives labeled thermal anomaly, classified. Years later, when the Cold War turned the mountains into a listening post, technicians at a Soviet radar station detected periodic bursts on 732 megacycles, Borodin's old channel exactly every 11 seconds lasting less than half a second. The pattern continued for months, always the same rhythm, always the same signal strength. Analysts thought it was equipment error, until one night an operator tuned the speaker on. The burst wasn't static, it was speech. Confirming, position, repeated once, then silence. The tape exists. It was catalogued as atmospheric sample Baksan 61, and those who heard it refused to work the night shift again. The contrast between logic and what remained unexplained deepened. The Red Army had long since erased the patrol from records, but the mountain refused to comply. In 1965, when new seismic instruments were installed along the Elbrus Ridge, they recorded subterranean vibrations at 10 Hz, the same waveform as Borodin's voice on the old tape transposed into the ground. It was as if the Earth had memorized the sound. Scientists proposed a resonance effect, frozen strata vibrating in sympathy with residual electromagnetic energy. Yet the tremors ceased the moment recording stopped and resumed when it began again, as if responding to being observed. German physicist Wilhelm Straube, who served in the Wehrmacht's Alpine Corps, later wrote that he too heard the mountain speaking through his field radio, a rhythm identical to Morse code, but made of breathing. He called it an echo with intent. Soviet engineers dismissed him, but their own data showed identical spectral fingerprints across decades. The folklore grew in parallel. Locals began calling the gorge the place that repeats. Shepherds told of hearing commands shouted in Russian on windless nights. Climbers reported voices counting numbers that matched radio coordinates. Some even claimed to hear replies when they called out names of the dead. In 1977, acoustic physicist Oleg Kramov returned with modern instruments. He placed microphones directly on the glacier. The recordings captured low-frequency hums, rising and falling in exact rhythm with weather changes. When filtered, the sound produced a waveform identical to human speech, truncated, reversed, fragmented. At minute 3 of the sample, a phrase emerged clearly. White light above the ridge. No one in the camp had spoken. Data analysis concluded that glacial shifts could reproduce phonetic shapes, creaks, and fractures mimicking syllables. But the probability of forming intelligible Russian words by random ice movement was statistically near zero. Kramov underlined it in his report, probability 0.0041%. In 1987, a mountaineering expedition rediscovered remnants of the vanished camp cloth fibers, fragments of rope and a wax-sealed tin box. Inside was a damp journal page with Borodin's handwriting, light still visible. No wind. Men restless. The ink ended mid-stroke. Forensic dating placed the note within an hour of the final transmission. The journal was sent to Moscow, never displayed. When Kramov asked to examine it, his clearance was revoked. Then came the digital age. In 2008, a private researcher digitized the original 1942 recording. For the first time, background noise could be isolated completely. Beneath Borodin's voice was another distorted, quieter, but synchronized perfectly in rhythm. The two voices overlapped until the final second, when one stopped and the other continued whispering the same line twice, white light above the ridge. The second repetition carried a lower pitch than any human throat could produce. Technically, this could be harmonic resonance signal decay, but when mapped on a spectrogram, the waveform showed a precise sinus pattern, not the random scatter of static. It was deliberate, structured, almost intentional. Experts could only write origin unknown. That same year, satellite imaging picked up intermittent electromagnetic surges from the Caucasus region, identical to 1942's frequency. Each lasted less than a second. When scientists attempted live monitoring, the surges ceased. When they stopped, the bursts resumed. The report's final line read, "Signal responds to observation." And so the escalation completes itself, from soldiers hearing voices to machines hearing echoes of those same voices decades later. Physics says the mountain cannot speak. Evidence says it does. Theories multiply: ionization, piezoelectricity, acoustic feedback, psychological contagion. Yet through all of them, the pattern endures the same rhythm, the same phrase, the same impossible persistence. Fact remains, the radio transmission existed, recorded, documented, analyzed. What followed, the reflections, the whispers, the lights, are all accounted for in files signed by men who believed in logic but wrote the word unexplained anyway. Maybe it was just storm ice static and fear. Maybe the patrol's final minutes were nothing more than sound, trapped between ridges, replayed until tape and air became one. But if that's true, why does the signal still return every winter, faint and precise, long after every transmitter has rusted away? The mountains do not forget frequencies. They only wait for someone to tune in. When the guns fell silent, the mountains kept their own war going, a quiet one made of echoes and absence. By early 1943, snow had erased the trenches, the smoke had lifted, and the front had moved north. But under the ice of the Baksan Gorge, the signal never died. Soviet engineers dismantled the last radio posts, yet one channel continued to whisper faint bursts, repeating Borodin's final words. The technicians called it an after-signal, a natural delay caused by atmosphere, but they could never trace the source. For months, it drifted in and out of range, a heartbeat inside static. White light above the ridge, the same line sometimes slower, sometimes reversed, as if the mountain itself had memorized the message. Command silenced it. The patrol was declared lost in meteorological disaster. Files were stamped, sealed, forgotten. The war needed certainty, not mysteries. Yet in every sector where veterans of the Caucasus were reassigned, strange incidents followed: radios picking up voices that called their names, bursts of code repeating old coordinates. Some soldiers smashed their sets, others prayed. No one reported it officially, but everyone remembered. When peace came, it brought no answers. The Caucasus remained a blank page of snow littered with relics and rumors. In 1952, a mountaineer named Sergei Lavrov claimed to have found a rusted signal pole halfway up the gorge, its wires humming, though no power lines reached that far. He said he heard something through the frost, a man reciting numbers, calm, disciplined, military. He followed the sound until the wind stopped, and then it was gone. The story was dismissed as altitude sickness, but the site was marked quietly on a classified map, Zone Echo. Throughout the 50s, the Soviet Army built new listening stations across the ridge. They intercepted everything from foreign propaganda to stray Morse. but one pattern kept returning pulses at 732 megacycles. Borodin's old channel sometimes for seconds, sometimes for minutes. When technicians amplified the signal, they heard it again, that same cadence, that same voice. They replaced cables, switched antennas, recalibrated receivers. The echo stayed. In one test, they turned every transmitter off simultaneously, and the signal still came through. The report ends with a single line, source external to equipment. Science tried to reclaim the story. Atmospheric physicists explained the voices as long-distance reflection, a trick of the ionosphere. Psychologists blamed trauma soldiers carrying the sound of their own fear. But the evidence refused to fade. The radio archive at Nalchik still held the melted coil, the frequency logs, the strange double trace of Borodin's words overlapping themselves. A loop with no beginning, no end. Then came a discovery that turned silence into accusation. In 1964, glaciologists drilling beneath the pass hit a hollow pocket air-trapped since the war. When they lowered a microphone, they picked up faint vibration, rhythmic, deliberate, like distant speech. They replayed it at normal speed, only wind, but when slowed tenfold, it formed syllables. The first word was confirming. The second was waiting. The finding never reached print. The lead scientist died in a car crash 2 months later. His notes vanished from the institute. But a technician kept a copy of the tape stored for decades until his son released it after the fall of the Soviet Union. The recording runs for 11 seconds, a whisper between static. When digitized, its spectral shape matched the 1942 signal with 98% accuracy. The voice was older, weaker, but identical. By then, both governments had changed, both armies long gone, but the mountain remained. In 1991, when the borders opened and Western climbers returned, they brought portable radios. Some tuned into the old shortwave bands for novelty. A French expedition in 1992 caught a burst on the same frequency, a man speaking Russian voice trembling. Visibility 0. Wind stopped. The phrase matched Borodin's last diary line word for word. The climbers laughed at coincidence until they realized the transmission had come from inside the valley below them, where no one stood. The story spread again in journals, documentaries, campfire retellings, always the same structure. A patrol lost, a signal, repeating a mountain that listens. Scientists hated it, but soldiers who had been there, or their sons, nodded quietly. They knew the sound. They'd heard it in dreams. As decades passed, the voices became a myth of endurance, not of survival, but of persistence. That somewhere in the frozen circuits of war, a human voice can outlast flesh, outlast memory, outlast reason. When Russia built a new radar array near Elbrus in 2008, engineers scanning background noise found faint oscillations at 7.32 MHz, again lasting less than half a second, repeating every night around 02:00. The same hour, Borodin vanished. The logbooks recorded it for 7 weeks. Then the data stream cut off during a blizzard. When the system rebooted, the signal was gone. The next night, it returned. Officially, it's nothing. Reflections, harmonics, interference. But the technicians who worked those shifts kept one tradition alive. When the wind dropped and the instruments went silent, they would lower their voices, almost whisper, as if someone might be listening back. One of them, in an interview years later, said, "We stopped trying to explain it. You can't argue with a voice that answers, and that's the turn." The moment history bends into something colder, quieter. The mountains took Borodin's patrol, but they left their sound behind. Decades of snow, decades of silence, and still the air remembers. Maybe it's only static, maybe it's only the physics of trapped frequencies echoing through stone. But every winter when the storm thickens over the ridge, the same whisper returns, faint but insistent, looping through the static, confirming position. No one knows who it's for anymore. Archive reference Baksan file 1942 E77, last transmission. Document recovered 1987. Translated 1991. Audio restored 2008. Transcript verified 2013. Source unknown. Duration 11 seconds. The original magnetic tape begins with a line of static that fades upward like wind through metal. At 2 seconds, the hum deepens. At 3 seconds, the voice enters male Russian accent, low, steady. Visibility 0. White light above the ridge. Then a crackle, and another voice identical, but softer, repeating the same phrase half a breath later. The two merge until the waveform becomes one. At 6 seconds, the pitch changes. Men restless. We are. The sentence breaks. Silence for half a second. Then the lower voice returns, almost whispering, not alone. The next instant, the signal spikes, the graph flares white, and everything collapses into a single hiss. The hum that follows lasts exactly 3 seconds before flattening into nothing. Engineers who cleaned the recording decades later wrote that the sound resembled breathing through frozen glass. They played it on loop to measure resonance decay, but each replay yielded a different end, the hiss tapering off at a slightly earlier point, as if the silence were consuming its own memory. The final data entry reads simply, "Residual current persists." In the same archive box lies a notebook page recovered beside the transmitter. 7 words still visible. If the wind stops, we are... No period. The paper torn where the ink froze midline. No further pages found. Beneath the note, a signature impression without ink, only pressure from a pen pressed into soaked paper. Forensic report, handwriting confirmed to Borodin, Mikhail, Captain, 9th Rifle Corps. Date indeterminate. No indication what became of the writer. The photographic record shows an empty camp tent, outlines upright rifles embedded in ice, no human form. The exposure captures the faint blur of snow moving sideways, not downward, suggesting crosswind or vibration at the moment of shutter. The negative edge carries a fingerprint later matched to the photographer who developed it, not the one who took it. He claimed the image appeared already half faded on the roll. When asked what he saw in it, he answered, only air. The last physical item in the case file is the RBM radio coil, half-melted interior, fused to the casing. Laboratory tests found carbonization inside the copper windings, but none on the exterior. The conclusion reads, heat originated internally, temperature unknown. No follow-up conducted. In 1988, a technician digitizing the reel noted a faint harmonic under the static. He slowed it to 1/10 speed and heard 4 pulses spaced like a heartbeat, then a pause, then 4 again. He annotated, not mechanical. His supervisor told him to delete the note. He underlined it instead. On the playback graph, the hum rises, plateaus, drops, then remains flat. No trace of life, no residual sound. But each time the file is opened, playback equipment draws an extra 0.2 volts of power, measurable and unexplained. Some say it's magnetization decay, others call it the mountain answering. The official summary closes the investigation with the line, all personnel presumed deceased. Recording terminated by environmental interference. No one amended it afterward. No report mentions the fact that the recording contains 11 seconds of silence beyond the end mark preserved intentionally. Archivists argued whether to trim it. They decided not to. That silence is part of the document. It hums faintly, even when the speakers are off a frequency lower than hearing, but still there, registering as weight more than sound. When visitors to the archive request to hear it, the curator warns them, there is nothing after second 11. And yet each listener insists they hear something, a low exhale, a breath, returning the sound of snow settling where words used to be. The last line of the preservation note says, do not clean, do not repair, let the oxide rest. Beyond that, no commentary. The tape ends, the reel stops spinning. What remains is static, then air, then nothing at all. And in that nothing, the story completes itself. The story of the Borodin Patrol ends not with discovery, but with preservation. What survived was not their bodies, not their weapons, but a handful of documents sealed inside an anonymous archive box. It was opened by accident 45 years later by a young historian sorting through mislabeled weather reports in the Regional Records Bureau of Nalchik. On the box lid, someone had written in pencil, meteorological anomaly, December 1942. Inside lay a corroded coil of radio wire, a single negative of a snow-covered camp, and an 11-second tape. He listened once, then again, and realized the voice he heard did not belong to any known recording in the collection. The register was older, the static heavier, the rhythm. Deliberate, a man speaking calmly from within a storm. The first words were clear. Visibility 0, white light above the ridge. The last word dissolved into noise. He copied the tape, filed a brief report, and sent it to the Central Archive in Moscow. No reply came. For decades, the tape was considered a curiosity, a relic of wartime interference until restoration technology made it audible again. What the technicians recovered startled them: two overlapping voices. The same man duplicated a fraction of a second apart. They could reproduce the phenomenon only by recording a playback through two different coils, but Borodin's patrol had only one. The duplication remained unexplained. The lab's conclusion, typed neatly on its final page, read, "Phenomenon not repeatable under controlled conditions." Today, the original reel is stored in the National Sound Archive of Moscow, catalog number NSA C42E77. Its oxide surface has darkened with time. The box is lined with soft paper, temperature controlled at 14 degrees Celsius. Each winter, the archive staff rewind it once to prevent sticking, and each time they listen for a few seconds, just to ensure it still plays. The voice always begins the same way, the static rising the line, returning white light above the ridge. Then silence. The notebook fragment recovered beside the transmitter that sits a continent away in a small glass case at the Regional Museum of Nalchik. The ink has turned gray. The handwriting trembles at the end of each stroke. Only one sentence remains readable. "If the wind stops, we are." The rest of the line is torn away. No one knows what came after. Next to it, the museum displays a photograph of Mount Elbrus at dusk, the same mountain, the same ridge, the same endless snow. Visitors often stand quietly before it, as if expecting something to move. At the Institute of Radio Engineering, scientists still reference the Borodin case when studying atmospheric distortion in high-altitude weather systems. The recording's harmonic curve defies replication. Some believe it was caused by reflected signal bounce, others by interference between magnetic fields in the storm. Yet no subsequent test under identical conditions has produced the same pattern. One engineer interviewed in 2014 said softly, "Sometimes the mountain keeps what it wants." His comment was edited out of the official transcript. The name Borodin appears nowhere in post-war military rosters. The entire unit was erased from Soviet order of battle by administrative revision. 32 soldiers became a footnote. Reconnaissance Group unconfirmed loss, Caucasus sector. The original typewriter ribbon used for that entry left a faint ghost impression beneath the next line of text, a pale shadow, visible only under infrared scan. Archivists noted it but could not read the letters. One suggested it might have been a signature. Since its rediscovery, the tape has circulated among universities, museums, and independent researchers. Some hear nothing but ordinary static. Others claim to perceive an echo inside the silence, a slow pulse that rises as the voice fades. When the sound is visualized on a spectrogram, the final seconds form an image like an open valley, a hollow framed by peaks. Acoustic analysts insist it's coincidence. Listeners prefer to call it landscape. Local legend filled the gaps that history could not. Shepherds in the Baksan Gorge speak of a place where the wind stops suddenly, where even birds fall silent. Climbers call it the listening pass. Some bring portable radios out of curiosity. Most hear nothing. A few record faint words, always the same ones, always in Russian. Each time the transmission lasts less than a breath. Weather stations deny broadcasting on that frequency. The phenomenon is officially listed as environmental noise. The debate between science and folklore has continued for decades, yet the facts remain the same. No bodies were found. No metallic wreckage beyond the single melted coil. No evidence of avalanche combat or sabotage. The only measurable artifact is sound, 11 seconds of it, and even that refuses to end cleanly. The silence that follows still registers a measurable current, a lingering charge that outlasts the voice. The data logs call it residual magnetization. The archivists call it memory. For historians, the Borodin file represents a bridge between eras, the analog whisper of a century that believed in proof and the digital world that must learn to live with uncertainty. It has been cited in studies of auditory illusion, in treatises on the psychology of absence, in documentaries about forgotten wars. Each retelling stretches the story slightly, but the center remains untouched. 32 men vanished into snow, leaving behind a transmission that no one can explain. Every few years, someone proposes a new expedition to the gorge. Permits are hard to obtain. Weather closes the pass for most of the year. Those who have gone report nothing unusual. Only wind ice, the hum of equipment, the slow movement of glacier over stone. Yet all of them describe a peculiar moment just before dawn when the valley falls completely silent and even breath sounds loud. One of them, a geologist, wrote in his field diary, "It feels like standing inside a paused recording." The phenomenon has inspired writers, artists, and filmmakers. Some portray it as haunting, others as redemption, the mountain keeping their voices alive. Academic circles prefer restraint. A symposium held in 2020, titled Echo as Evidence, concluded that the persistence of Borodin's transmission demonstrates the endurance of signal beyond intention. In simpler terms, a human voice once sent still moves through matter. It does not disappear, it only changes medium. The final question remains unsolved: why the signal sometimes returns. Satellite sensors recorded bursts of 7.32 megacycles in 2019 and again in 2022, each lasting less than a second, originating within the same coordinates as the original transmission. The readings were too faint to analyze, too precise to dismiss. The report closed with 2 words: no source. Maybe that is what history becomes when all the voices are gone. No source, only resonance, a pattern left in the air. The Borodin case endures because it offers no closure, only the possibility that listening itself keeps memory alive. The mountains hold their silence, and somewhere within it, an echo still travels, a faint reminder that time does not erase what was once spoken. It only buries it deeper. The last words of the archive curator who handled the reel before it was sealed in permanent storage were simple: every recording waits to be played again. She switched off the light, closed the door, and left the hum of the vault to fade into the air. The record remains there today, spinning once each winter, 11 seconds of voice followed by the longest silence in the world. You've just heard another archive from Classified Chronicles. If you'd like to uncover more, subscribe and keep listening.